We've all heard of World War II. It was a global war that involved most countries in the world and resulted in over 70 million deaths. But what if I told you there was a war just as brutal that happened only 2 decades prior? It had its roots in imperialism, militarism, and nationalism. And, like World War II, it would completely change the world. This is the Second Sino-Japanese War. In the early 20th century, China was in many ways a sleeping giant. Although it had the largest population in the world, it was still largely untouched by Western powers. However, one power that had already carved out a large chunk of Chinese territory was Japan. After defeating Russia in 1905, Japan had gained control of Korea and began to set its eyes on China. The Japanese military began to grow rapidly and soon had their sights set on China. Tensions continued to grow between the two countries until July 7, 1937, when everything kicked off. But before we get into the war, I want to talk about how this channel was started. As a kid, I was fascinated by history and would devour any book I could get my hands on. One day, I stumbled across a book about ancient Rome, and from that moment on, I was hooked. I wanted to know more about the fall of the Roman Empire. And so I read every book I could find on the topic. It was until years later that I realized I might be one of the few people who actually enjoyed reading history books for fun. I decided to share my passion for history with the world by starting this channel. Ancient Rome is still one of my favorite topics to this day, and I've done dozens of videos on the fall of Rome. I've also covered many other topics in history, including the collapse of the Soviet Union, the reign of Genghis Khan, and the War of 1812. My goal is to make history come alive for my viewers, and to show that it doesn't have to be boring. If you love history, or just want to learn more about the past, then please subscribe. We're really so close to hitting 100,000 subscribers, and none of that would have been possible without your support. On July 7, 1937, a small group of Japanese soldiers were traveling through the Chinese city of Wamping. When they claimed that one of their soldiers had gone missing, they demanded that the Chinese turn over the soldier. But when the Chinese refused, the Japanese soldiers attacked. Soon, the entire Japanese army was engaged in heavy fighting with the Chinese. Within a week, the Japanese had taken control of Beijing and began to push south. As the Japanese advanced, they committed horrific atrocities against the Chinese civilians. Villages were burned to the ground, women were raped, and countless civilians were murdered. As the fighting continued, it became clear that the war would not end anytime soon. In fact, it would last for 8 long years. The Chinese were able to inflict heavy casualties on the Japanese, but they were ultimately defeated. By the end of the war, the Japanese would occupy all of eastern China and much of the country's natural resources. Despite the heavy losses, the Chinese were able to hold out long enough for the Allies to enter the war. On December 8, 1941, the Japanese would declare war on the United States after attacking Pearl Harbor. This brought the United States and China together as allies. Together, they would fight back against the Japanese and eventually win the war. By late 1944, the tide of the war had turned against Japan. The Chinese and Americans were pushing the Japanese back on all fronts. In April 1945, the Chinese would launch a massive offensive known as the WWII River Campaign. The goal of the campaign was to capture the city of Suzhou, which was an important transportation hub for the Japanese. The campaign was a resounding success, and the Chinese were able to capture Suzhou just weeks later. The Japanese were forced to retreat westward, where they were eventually captured or killed. With the fall of Suzhou, the Japanese were on the run. Over the next few months, the Chinese and Americans would liberate much of eastern China. In August 1945, the Japanese would surrender after 2 atomic bombs were dropped on their mainland. This brought an end to the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Second World War. The Second Sino-Japanese War was one of the most brutal conflicts in modern history. It pitted 2 of Asia's great powers against each other and resulted in millions of deaths. But it was also a conflict that has been largely forgotten by the world. Most people today have never heard of the Second Sino-Japanese War, but it was a conflict that had a profound impact on the world. One of the most important things to understand about the Second Sino-Japanese War is the way that it began. The war did not start with a Japanese invasion of China. Instead, it started with a small border skirmish. This is important because it shows that the war was not inevitable. There were many chances for the conflict to be avoided, but the Japanese leaders chose to pursue a more aggressive foreign policy. This led them down a path of war with China. Another important thing to understand about the war is the role that nationalism played. Both China and Japan were victims of extreme nationalism during the war. This led to a lot of hatred and violence between the two sides. The Japanese were brainwashed from a young age to believe that they were superior to the Chinese. This made it easy for the Japanese government to convince the public that war with China was justified. The Chinese, on the other hand, were desperate to end foreign influence in their country. They saw the Japanese as a foreign threat and rallied together to resist the invasion. Perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from the Second Sino-Japanese War is the importance of diplomacy.
The war could have been avoided if the Japanese leaders had been willing to negotiate with the Chinese, but instead, they chose to go to war.
This led to millions of deaths and untold suffering. The world is a dangerous place, and there will always be conflicts. But we must remember the lessons of the past and try to avoid war at all costs. Diplomacy is the only way to ensure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. The Second Sino-Japanese War is often overshadowed by World War II, but it was just as brutal and had an equally profound impact on the world. The war began in 1937 when the Japanese invaded China. The Japanese were driven by a desire for power and control, while the Chinese were fighting for their very survival. The war would last for 8 long years and result in millions of deaths. The Japanese would commit horrible atrocities against the Chinese civilians, but the Chinese were able to hold out until the Allies entered the war. Together, the Chinese and Americans would defeat the Japanese and bring an end to the war in 1945. The Second Sino-Japanese War was a conflict that could have been avoided. The Japanese leaders chose to pursue a more aggressive foreign policy, which led them to war with China. The war was fought between two of Asia's great powers and resulted in millions of deaths. The war had a profound impact on the world, and we must remember the lessons of the past to ensure that such a conflict never happens again. Now I want to hear from you. What did you think of the Second Sino-Japanese War? And what do you think is the most important lesson we can learn from the conflict? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, then be sure to subscribe and check out my other content. Thanks for watching.